Welcome back, everybody. Sorry for... I'd like to introduce our next presenter. And the title of her talk today is Sensual Excess, Moving Through the Flesh to Elsewhere. Amber Jamilla Musser is Associate Professor of American Studies at George Washington University. Her research is at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality studies. Dr. Musser has also published widely on race and critical theory, queer femininities and race, race and sexuality, and queer of color critique. She has a master's in women's studies from Oxford University and received her PhD in history of science from Harvard University. She is also the author of Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism, published by NYU Press in 2014, which uses masochism as an analytic frame to theorize felt relationships to power. And she's also the author of Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity, and Brown Jouissance, again with NYU Press, published last year in 2018. This book centralizes women of color's aesthetics to reimagine sexuality, and it received a 2018 Arts Writers Grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation. She is also a co-editor, along with Kaji Amin and Roy Perez, of Queer Form, a special issue of ASAP Journal on Aesthetics and Queer of Color Critique. And currently she is beginning a project on noise, ethics, and aesthetics, and writes art reviews for Brooklyn Rail. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Amber to give us a talk. Thank you, Amber.
Thank you, Hypatia. I'm really excited to be here and share all of this with you today. So an image rises to the surface as if by magic. We see flecks of white slowly emerge. They become shimmering accents, indicating the fullness of lips, the edges of teeth, the tip of a nose, the crease of an eyelid, or the sheen of pearls in an image that resolves into that of a head tilted slightly back, with eyes closed and mouth side open. The shallow focus, foreground shine, while the rest of the image, shoulders backlit and covered with a fur stole, is hazy. This is Lyle Ashton Harris's Billy 21, one of a series of performative self-portraits from Harris's 2002 series, Billy, Boxers, and Better Days. In addition to Holiday, Harris includes photographs of himself in the guise of Josephine Baker, a bloodied boxer, and other iconic images of Black performers from the early 20th century. So here's some of the other images. Taken together, the series features an array of gender performances, which Anna DeVere Smith describes as an improvisation, as jazz. But it is Billy 21 that I choose to focus on because it shows us multiple ways of thinking about the relationship between self-performativity and brown jouissance, that mysterious fleshiness that resists legibility but hovers on the surface. Brown jouissance, I argue, gives us ways to think about the possibilities of resignifying fleshiness by showing us that which is not encumbered by discourses of sexuality, but that which traffics in sensuality. That amorphous quality of fleshiness that Hortense Spillers argues was assigned to the captive body. In thinking with the possibilities of the pornotrope, I position my work as occupying the space of yes and in relation to Afro-pessimism. I ask what it might be to take the violence of the pornotrope and the accompanying impossibility of sovereign subjectivity seriously, while dwelling in the selfhoods, intimacies, and knowledge systems that emerge from thinking with the flesh. For me, the pornotrope offers insight into the affective areas of racialization. In understanding race through the affective and sensational circuits of power and performance, we see that the pornotrope not only names the fleshiness of Black and brown people, but also helps us to unpack these relationships to signification, enabling us to read otherwise. Turning to the violence of the pornotrope allows us to see the radical potential of excess without flattening the violence at its core. Importantly, to think with pornotroping is to acknowledge that some people circulate as highly charged affective objects, while simultaneously being positioned outside the parameters of normative sexuality and subjectivity. We see this acutely in the ways that Black women are posited as the fleshy limit of theory. To think with the flesh is to hold violence and possibility in the same frame. It is also an act of reclaiming and remaking selfhood, and asserting that selfhood, though not a sovereign subject, exists in relation to minoritarian knowledge production and epistemologies of sensuality. We are able to see that flesh becomes something else, a space of possibility, interiority, and creativity. Rather than merely abdicating subjectivity, these reclamations of selfhood through brown jouissance provide a scaffolding for imagining and prioritizing ways of being that center coexisting, caring, and sensuality. The concept of brown jouissance emphasizes the production of selfhood in relation to the social. While the self-other relation underlies all formulations of jouissance, the other is often neglected. But relations with the other bring objectification, race, and gender into the mix. To emphasize the other in theorizing jouissance, then, is to think with the pornotrope and emphasize the simultaneous projections of racialization and gendering that occur through its particular modes of objectification. This is signaled by the adjective brown, which stands for the jouissance that comes through racialization. Brown jouissance, I argue, occurs in moments when the thing, other, and object converge to form selfhoods. So I've been emphasizing the work of brown jouissance because I explore its multiple iterations in my book, Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity and Brown Jouissance. This discussion of Billy 21 is part of that project, but in this talk I'm focusing on citation as an aspect of brown jouissance and shine as one of its aesthetics. So in Billy 21, it is significant that many of the elements that shine, pearls, eyeshadow, and lipstick, decorate or cover Harris's body. They alter its surface, and they also make a spectacle of these superficial alterations. Taken together, these attributes emphasize the ways that surface hints at the pleasures of opacity. This follows Ang Cheng's argument that the 20th century fascination with surface emerges from a fetishization of transparency and the mysteries of the visible. In other words, we can understand surface as the underside of the scientific and pornographic drive toward locating knowledge in an objective image. In contradistinction with the ideology of objectivity and transparency, flirting with the surface, Chan asserts, can lead to a profound engagements with and reimaginings of the relationship between interiority and exteriority, between essence and covering. This means that surface offers the possibility of doubleness, troubling transparency and the idea of authenticity. In this way, surface complicates categorization because it confounds ideas of what knowledge is, where it lies, and how we can apprehend it. Cheng writes that the problem of the modern surface is distinguishing decoration as surplus from what is proper to the thing. Shine also complicates matters because of the way it is imbricated in representations of blackness. Krista Thompson argues that the popularity of shine in Black diasporic art has to do with its ability to thwart intimacy. Shine distracts from the mandate of transparency and mobilizes hypervisibility, the cover of surface, so that interiorities remain opaque. Thompson argues that shine enables an unvisibility, so that blackness is spectacular but not knowable. Thompson also, however, explicitly links shine to the history of the commodification of brown bodies, arguing that shine calls attention to the excess of materiality that commodification entails. In particular, she describes shine as a distinct aesthetic of material excess that highlights the spectacular display of material surplus. By drawing attention to this material excess, however, shine illuminates the possibilities of resistance, namely unvisibility, that emerge when we think with the commodity. Unvisibility is what happens when we turn commodification and objectification on its head. In other words, shine makes it difficult to separate the fleshiness of Black bodies from the materiality of the decorative. This calls into question the separateness of the categories of person and thing without embracing any of the negative affects of commodification. Shine plays joyfully with the idea of the body as body while rejecting the demand to present anything other than surface. Thompson writes, in many ways, we might see fascination with adorning and picturing the body's surface and jewels, the taking on of the shame of things as a type of screen. So that Harris makes shine the focus of Billy 21, then, can be read as a form of resistance to an intimacy mandated by the dictates of white supremacy, even and especially in negrophilia, which is explicitly the focus of Harris's series. There are, however, other sensuous relations, albeit murky ones, of fire in the photograph. Most notably, the image allows us to imagine that we are seeing an intimate glimpse of Billie Holiday. Intimate because we can imagine that we are glimpsing Holiday in ecstasy. The closed eyes are signs of a private reverie, while the open mouth suggests excess. These are pleasures that cannot be contained. Their expression exceeds the frame. We might, for example, begin to imagine that we know some of these private pleasures because we have a concept of holiday in her life. We might ask if this is the holiday of Emerson's bar and grill, high and drunk, stumbling and slurring words and emotions as she remembers a history in the limelight and various betrayals, arrests, and addictions that altered her trajectory towards stardom. Is this the holiday of Carnegie Hall, wounded and rambling and so eager for a comeback that she accidentally punctured her head with a hat pin attached to the gardenias? Is this a younger holiday, just beginning to sing in jazz clubs after a youth spent in brothels? Holiday is iconic. Her voice famously layers pain and yearning. Billy 21 indexes these histories of wounded fleshiness, even as it allows us to imagine an inhabitation that exists in excess of them, an excess in the voice, an excess of selfhood that cannot be fully subsumed by her iconicity in public self, an excess that is part of Harris and emblematic of Brown jouissance. So what these surface aesthetics bring us towards, I argue, is citation. Unlike Judith Butler's concept of the citational self, which has to do with the way small acts aggregate into the idea of a coherent subject with depth, Harris's performance in Billy 21 works antithetically to the idea of coherence in its attachment to surface. Further, knowing that holiday is not Harris's final destination, the other photographs in the series feature other performances of black iconicity, allows us to see that Harris is not necessarily interested in producing holiday, or himself as holiday, as a coherent self, even as an avatar, in relation to psychic interiority. Instead, Harris as holiday is but one momentary surface that we contend with. In this way, Harris's vision of the citational self works to reveal the space of otherness within the self. This production of the mysterious self is in keeping with Emilia Jones's analysis of the work that performative self-portraits do. She argues that by exaggerating their performances of themselves, performative self-portraits explore the capacity of the self-portrait photograph to foreground the I as other to itself, the artistic subject as taking place in the future through interpretive acts that bring her or him back to life via memory and desire. What Jones means by this is that these versions of self-portraiture go beyond mere representation and mark creative forms of expressivity that reveal forms of self that exceed capture. In this way, the photograph becomes what Jones describes as a technology of embodiment, and yet one that paradoxically points to our tenuous and incoherence as living embodied subjects. The force of Billy 21 then emerges in our recognition that the photograph is explicitly not revealing Harris's interiority, but that it instead illuminates the possibility of reading Harris as a plural self, both in relation to Holiday through his performance of citation, and in relation to the otherness of himself that he summons. Harris's citation of Holiday is not just about his relationship to her, it is also about Black femininity and understanding the way it functions as a space of otherness within Harris's formulation of selfhood. In describing Harris's work, Anna DeVere Smith positions Harris's approach to Black femininity as part of his self-narration, but his relationship to it is complex. In an essay that accompanies the series, she writes, "If you know Lyle, you know that he says a lot of words very quickly. One such string of words was, a sissy by 5, a faggot by 7, a bitch by 12, a cunt by 18. These were all called to me." In these phrases, we see that Black femininity is both an entity that coalesces into violence because it emerges in the sexual pejoratives thrown upon him by others, and an entity that operates as a resource for his selfhood that he wants to inhabit. This duality illuminates the way that the idea of otherness hovers around Black femininity itself. This otherness is not just the otherness that comes from the performative self-portrait, it is an otherness produced by racism and phallocentrism. It is an otherness that makes it difficult to hold Blackness and gender differentiation together, so that femininity and Blackness are not concepts that are at odds with each other. In Spiller's argument that Blackness becomes equated with depersonalization, non-subjectivity, and thingness, Black women become estranged from femininity because they are denied the symbolic space of the mother and assigned to the category of materiality. This fleshiness circulates within the realm of objectification, but it does not grant Black women even the imaginary of interiority. As such, Spillers describes Black women as, quote, the beached whale of the sexual universe. This is to say that Black femininity exists outside of the symbolic order. While Black femininity is not interchangeable with Black women, Spillers comment that Black women lack access to conventional discourses of sexuality, allows us to see femininity as a gendered term wrapped up in particular ideologies of what constitutes being desired and desiring. To argue that Black women do not have access to femininity is to say that they are not imagined to possess desire. This seeming contradiction is what leads Denise Ferreira da Silva to argue that the sexual female racialized body presents a particular form of disruptive excess. This body is excessive because it inhabits the space of desiring, even as it emerges from a structure that presumptively negates access to desire and interiority. This form of inhabitation has no mode of expression within the realm of the linguistic, however. This excess exists on the side of the thing. Reading Spillers and Da Silva together, then, we come toward understanding Black femininity as closely connected to the flesh, objectification, and thingness, and exterior to discourses of sovereign subjectivity and the symbolic. We see this fleshiness of Black femininity, this refusal of a linguistic imperative towards speech, and sensual excess in Billy 21. By explicitly aligning himself with Black femininity, Harris emphasizes his relationship to otherness. To take up Holiday even momentarily is to foreground his inhabitation of sissy, faggot, bitch, and cunt. These words are indicative of Black feminity's relationship to objectification and proximity to violence. To position them in explicit dialogue with Holiday is to make central the ways that Black femininity is experienced in relation to woundedness, even as it gestures towards the resistive possibilities of excess. That we might understand this movement toward Black femininity as a form of what Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari describe as becoming woman, Harris is performing something else. His explicit invocation of Black femininity and fleshiness challenges the assumed and impossible gendered and race neutrality upon which becoming woman relies. Harris uses his citation of Holiday to illustrate the pull of otherness that Black femininity produces. This is why it is important that his transformation is enacted through makeup and surgical tape. This is not a performance of becoming. Harris does not become Holiday in that he does not inhabit her worldview or positionality. Instead, he cites her, positioning his body alongside hers so that we might read the image to understand their mutual investment in Black femininity. Though becoming woman or becoming minor is not about inhabiting interiority or claiming psychic depth, it does rely on a particular form of sincerity in that we approach the possibility of woman or minor as a concrete possibility. What Harris's citation of Holiday shows us, on the other hand, is the ways in which Black femininity is always fluid, always shifting, and never quite attainable. In its impermanence, the transformation that Harris enacts is not sincere because it does not have depth, but surface in that it relies on and highlights the mutability of flesh rather than interiority. This position enlarges what we understand as Black femininity. It also importantly gives us a way to understand citation as a mode of inhabitation that shifts the dimensions of selfhood. One does not become, but rather one sits alongside the other in citation. This alongsideness, in turn, makes it impossible to think of Harris's self-portrait as displaying a sovereign self. Instead, Billy 21 shows us Holiday and Harris in relation, as a plural self. Through posture, gloss, surgical tape, and props, Harris's citation of Holiday mid-song gives Harris a way to illustrate the particular parameters of race, gender, and sexuality that make his body and his mode of inhabiting the world legible, while also providing him with a blueprint for exploring what exceeds this frame. I use the word citation because it helps us to see the transgenerationality of their relationship, and it allows us to understand the relationship as one that relies on fleshiness and surface. Harris uses surgical tape to reshape his nose so that he appears more similar to Holiday. Likewise, the other superficial elements of his performance can be located in his use of pearls, flowers, and makeup. This helps us to merge Harris and Holiday visually, but citation is a deeper act. It is an act that requires Harris to read Holiday, which is to say to attempt to understand her, her life, her experience, and to translate those elements using his flesh into something we can understand. This is not about exchange. Holiday cannot borrow from Harris, but Harris links his body to hers in a way that emphasizes gesture as a mode of knowledge transmission or objectification, because Harris puts his body on the line, not so that we can produce Holiday as object, but so that we can imagine inhabitation. This gesture may be connected to Holiday as icon, but it is manifest in Harris's body as interpreter. Citation then allows us to ponder what exactly one inhabits when one borrows from Holiday. What comes from Harris and what comes from Holiday, and what do we do with this trans-temporal merging of corporality? This trans-temporality brings us to queer femininity. While femininity is often unable to be imagined without collapsing under the weight of materiality, here I offer an alternate narration of femininity that keeps us attentive to the flesh. I call this queer femininity, since thinking processes of racialization in relation to femininity stretches its boundaries in particular ways. Returning once again to Spiller's argument that Black and brown women become estranged from femininity on multiple levels, we come to the missing matter of the mother. Spillers writes, "In this play of paradox, only the female stands in the flesh, both mother and mother dispossessed. This problematizing of gender places her, in my view, out of the traditional symbolics of female gender, and it is our task to make place for this different social subject." To find this queer femininity, then, we must go outside of the symbolic and toward the mother. To invoke the mother, however, is, as I'm sure you can guess, to set off waves of existential panic. Motherhood in particular has been understood as a limitation for women. Shishilmuth Firestone famously wrote that the heart of women's oppression is her childbearing and child-rearing role. Likewise, Lynn Huffer writes, "The mother is in fact the most extreme expression of the construction of the feminine as negativity, absence, invisibility, meaninglessness, silence, loss. In becoming a mother, then, a woman is transformed from subject or proto-subject into a void, a being that exists to sacrifice. In order to give to her offspring, she denies herself." But thinking with Spillers and Brown Jouissance, I argue that queer femininity is not necessarily attached to motherhood or self-denial, but it emerges through an insistence on keeping the mother at the center of a project of selfhood and intimacy. Grappling with the mother, in turn, produces a rich world where the presumed goals of subjectivity, individuality, and omnipotence are undermined. Not only is individuality revealed to be the product of violence, but it is also shown to be impossible. One is always in a state of coexistence and emerged in violence. Vulnerability is the underside of fantasies of omnipotence, and love and hate must be woven together in order to provide a path towards existing ethically as a self in the world. But when we dwell on race in relation to the mother, these relationships become even more complicated. To be racialized is already to exist in a process of violent enfleshment that shapes the possibilities of being. And as Spillers reminds us, pornotroping has historically also been accompanied by a violent erasure of mothers and mothering. Here, I argue, we think about the relations to the mother through absence and traces of presence and attachment. The multiple permutations of selfhood, the citational self being one of them, that we find in Brown Jouissance, offers us multiple ways of thinking about relating to the mother. As such, I argue that thinking the Black and brown mother requires that we attend to sensuality, aesthetics, and embodiment. Brown Jouissance, then, can be read as a project of recovery and survival. In finding permutations of selfhood that exceed the I, we come close to the missing matter of these Black and brown mothers. This space of difference and coexistence, I argue, resides in thinking about the Black and brown mother as a place, and elsewhere, that is always adjacent to Blackness and brownness and accessible through the sensual. And that's sort of where my book ends. But the question I often get, I like to leave people hanging. But the question really is, what is this elsewhere? So beyond Harris's turn to the Polaroid, where elsewhere is largely internal, I'm going to show us a little clip now. I'm turning to the multimedia artist Jacoby Satterwhite and his recent installation at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to help ground this idea of elsewhere in something concrete. So En Plein Air, the music of objective romance, is an installation accompanied by comprised of a series of films that Satterwhite made that were projected behind him as he danced on a platform. So here is a few minutes of that.
It's freedom in my house. There is no doubt. There's freedom in my house. When you come into my house, there is no doubt. There's a feeling of healing in my house. It will never go away or never go astray. There's feeling in my house that won't ever die. It's feeling in my house that won't ever die. It's feeling.
It goes on, but we don't have that much time. So Satterwhite dedicates the piece to his mother, Patricia, who died in 2016, and it's clear that the installation represents several modes of relating to her. Her presence makes itself known most legibly as the vocal soundtrack, which is her voice. In the clip we saw, she sings, healing in my house, healing in my house. When you come into my house, there's no doubt there's feeling of healing in my house. On the one hand, the song's catchy lyrics suggest a particular function for the maternal, which cover the auspices of care and domesticity. Here we can think about the mother in relation to homemaking and healing. This is a version of thinking with the maternal that is particularly tethered to Melanie Klein's concept of the reparative. The message of a healing home, in particular, might be especially resonant for Satterwhite, given that much of his youth was spent with his mother, drifting in and out of his mental institutions because of her schizophrenia. The healing that is happening in her house might be happening in relation to her ability to mother or her desire to go home in order to heal. But instead of lingering with these questions of psyche and keeping with the surface of Satterwhite's intervention, I want us to think about the elsewhere as a surface structure. So in my reading, it's comprised of several components, one of them being Patricia's voice, which is recorded on 155 audio cassettes made between 1994 and 1998. Though the tapes were made for an album that Patricia never composed, which we can think about as another kind of elsewhere, Satterwhite's care in preserving these materials and presenting them speaks to a particular relation to the mother. He becomes a steward of her voice. He listened, selected, and digitized the sounds, and then helped to compose the backing music since they were originally recorded a cappella. This curation is a form of care, which is particularly augmented when we think about the ways that recordings function as technologies to embody and generate memory. The cassette tape in particular, with its fragile magnetic strips, is a technology that grants access to do-it-yourself forms of recording and remixing, but degrades quite easily with time. It is also, because tape-based, a very haptic medium. Though Satterwhite digitized the contents, dealing with these cassettes requires handling and tactile forms of care. Here, Satterwhite's mother, Patricia, is more than a psychic space of loss. She is flesh and possibility. More precisely, she's a condition of possibility. And here we might recall Tina Camp's invocation of the conditional tense to speak of Black feminist futurity. Restoring the spatiality of the mother gives flesh, material to this possibility. That some of this possibility happens through the sonic is important. Satterwhite's mother's voice brings us towards all of the possibilities, and while this is not quite the womb-like matrixial space that Braha Ettinger invokes in her discussion of the maternal shaping of desire and subjectivity, it's not necessarily that distant. I dwell on Ettinger's invocation of the dissolution of boundaries in utero as a way to emphasize the fleshiness of the sonic, which is frequently described as touch at a distance, because even if a sound is not heard, its vibrations, as we heard earlier, right, make an impact. Thinking further with the amorphous quality of vibrations, we can see that Satterwhite approaches his mother through more indirect means as well, through dance and video. The video, whose colors a critic compares to a palette of eyeshadow, specifically the soft and glittery smoky plum, chocolate rosewood, deep gold, and antique olive, combines several different versions of the fantastical. There are mythical mechanical creatures, which were based on drawings made by Patricia, and virtual gyrating characters assembled from a world of BDSM pornography that combined evoke a psychedelic sci-fi sensibility. This is intercut with footage of Satterwhite spinning and dancing in a windowless basement and bathroom. Following Tavia Nyong'o, who argues that fabulation points to the deconstructive relation between story and plot, we can think about these various imaginary worlds as reworking anything that we might think we know about the relation between mother and child. Satterwhite has inserted other things into the narrative space that would speak of loss. Here, fabulation provides us with an inroad into elsewhere. All of these spaces of narrative divergence, Sci-fi creatures, BDSM, and dancing all explicitly bracket the present. They exist in a temporality of always and already and now, so that we can see this elsewhere is not an event, but something that exists always alongside. Further, the aesthetics of BDSM and sci-fi both produce an oscillation between abjection and expressivity in relation to sensuality. We can see this especially in the video's emphasis on constant motion and undulation. There are whips and tendrils that propel walking. Figures grind on a toilet seat and dance. Though deconstructive of the present moment in space and time, these modes of fabulation bring the body into the mix. In this way, they remind us of the powerful ways that the vibrations of elsewhere are felt in unexpected ways, but that they are indeed felt in and through the body. It is this explicit solicitation and mobilization of the flesh that I use to connect this video to an elsewhere, one that lives not just in Satterwhite's mind, but one that can be accessed through his body. This in turn brings us toward thinking about his dancing, which is the live component of the installation. One critic describes the spinning move as capoeira, but when we see Satterwhite perform live, it hews more closely to the family of voguing, the system of dancing that Jose Munoz describes as a mode of survival. In Cruising Utopia, he writes, "I am proposing that we might see something other than a celebration in these moves, the strong trace of Black and queer racialized survival, the ways in which children need to imagine being other in the face of conspiring cultural logics of white supremacy and heteronormativity. What Munoz is emphasizing is the ways that fiction is necessary for survival. Voguing is a mode of fabulation in which one writes oneself into a desired norm." There is, however, a certain irony in bringing this dance of the ball scene into the museum space. As Ariel Osterweiss notes, when dance is subsumed by the museological preoccupation of static display, it is charged with the resurrective function of announcing itself as present, live, and vital. This is to say that while the institution produces stasis and the reification of categories, dance and voguing in particular announce a different kind of currency, something charged with difference. In this case, the live voguing is related both to Blackness and the maternal elsewhere. So with Satterwhite, we see that there are multiple versions of elsewhere circulating simultaneously: the sonic, the virtual, and voguing. Each of them reflects something different about relating to this geography of the missing Black mother, but they are each about imagination and relation. Each avoids the trap of recognition and individuation in order to dwell in the milieu of sense and flesh. These multiplicities are the matter of the mother, and they offer us ways to think about elsewhere as a set of movements and practices. Ultimately, I ask us to dwell on this idea of elsewhere and queer femininity in order to highlight what comes from thinking with sensuality and fleshiness. This order of knowledge, I argue, is spatial because it resists the mandate of depth even as it traffics in self-creation. This is a spatiality of possibility, of the always already, and it speaks to embrace plurality, spirituality, and sensuality. This transformation enables contemplation of femininity in relation to possibility and violence. It is an elsewhere to sexuality, to phallocentrism, to white supremacy. It is what emerges from and yet what exceeds the pornotrope. An invitation to think with the flesh, with the sensual, is an invitation to make new knowledges and new politics. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for a discussion and for Q&A. So I'm very happy. Thank you so much for this wonderful paper, and especially for your thinking with Satterwhite and the moving to the elsewhere with this particular piece. And so I'd like to just maybe start off with some comments, and then we could open it up for questions. I was really intrigued by this provocative paradox that you lay out between surface and opacity, and I'd love to think more with you about how the shine is a kind of has a fugitiveness to it, and then thinking of that in relation to citation as the pluralizing of the self. And it brought to mind as well practices of drag as well, and I was wondering if you had also considered this citation in relation to drag. And well, I have a lot, but maybe we could start with those comments.
Is this on? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, so Hypatia is the one who told me that I should talk about Satterwhite. So you have her to thank for this.
I was very moved. Well, we had discussed this film together because of the ending of Amber's book, which ends with the maternal and the elsewhere, and then so we were talking about this work, but then to see how you ran with it was so enlightening and very moving to hear you speak of it today.
But I'll go back to thinking about surface and opacity, and I think one of my main concerns, I guess, is sort of one of the reasons I'm so insistent on this idea of selfhood in relation, or selfhoods in relation to brown jouissance, is because I think it's dangerous to see the possibility of the self, but the question becomes what you want to bundle that with. So it's really important to me to have the idea of interiority, but to keep that inaccessible. And so that's sort of from that central setup is where that tension between this. So if you have this unknown interiority, how do you make it known? And that's part of why the surface becomes so important, because it allows sort of expressivity, but it also resists at the same time.
Right, so it resists legibility.
So it resists legibility, but it definitely comes, hand in hand with this idea of opacity, right?
Yeah, it makes me think of Glissant's the right to opacity, our right to opacity, the anti-colonial right to opacity.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And so I guess, so then that makes more sense in how shine then becomes also this moment of kind of,
because then, so once surface becomes important, thinking about it really, it produces the aesthetic as a really important mode of political thinking, right? And then, particular tactics like shine, now I'm blanking on other ones, but other things that one could do aesthetically have this other kind of currency, because it's not just what they're doing there, but they are also enabling other things to sort of happen underneath the surface while this other thing is going on. So I sort of like that idea, and shine in particular is so fascinating because it's so I don't talk about distraction, but we can also think about sort of the way that surface works is also just by pulling attention to this other thing. And shine, you can really feel that
to the
in particular ways.
Spectacular, okay, and so so in relation to citation, then mobilizing shine and surface as modes of citation, and then how that then attunes itself with this plurality of selfhood, or kind of unleashes these excess surfaces as plurality of.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what's happening with shine and citation, so they're both happening in the image, but they're sort of two different operations, really. So on the one hand, shine allows for the possibility of interiority that we don't know, where citation is, I'm arguing, Harris's mode of being with Holiday. And so I'm thinking about, so in that way, citation for me is more about the lining up of interiorities. So one could think about it in relation to drag. It's hard for me to sort of generalize it out beyond just sort of like the parameters of like a particular object.
Yes, I get that.
And so in some ways, like the possibility of shine makes it possible, or not, the enactment of shine makes it possible for Harris to produce this mode of being with Holiday and this sort of opening up. So one of the other arguments that I'm making in the book is in dislodging this idea of the sovereign subject, but prioritizing selfhood. All of the selfhoods are plural. It's all about trying to figure out what are the different modes that people are existing in relation to each other, and sort of trying to kind of amplify that type of coexistence. So citation being one of them.
And that's really resonates so interestingly with Satterwhite's practice of citation, the citing of his mother's her voice, but also with along with the surfaces that he's playing with and creating. So it's a really nice bridge to think the citation. In a moving in this video, and also made me. You mentioned this moment. I found it very important where there's this kind of tension when dance is this kind of what Jose Munoz called the burden of liveness of particular. Racialized bodies, and so and how the burden of liveness kind of dismisses a past as well as a future, right? Because we're just in the live. So I was also very interested to think again in this practice of citation, this plurality of selves in Satterwhite's work, but also in Lyle's work, is how it's not just also. It's like you call it the trans-temporal as well. It's not just a plurality of self, but it's also moving back and to the future as well. Yeah.
Well, which is part of why the whole framing is about relating to the mother, right? Because it's sort of about, in doing that, it alters what counts as temporality, right? It moves us away from a temporality of linearity and event based, and sort of it thinks about like all of that which is always around, right? And sort of there are different modes of tapping into that and then tapping out of it, but just sort of it's trying to think about how to recognize that which is always kind of circulating and is always sort of with us in certain ways.
I think that's very it's very palpable in the Satterwhite video as well. Okay, well, would like to open it up for some questions, because we have just, actually we only have a couple of minutes, sorry. Yeah. Oh no, we have a...
Hi, thank you very much. I really liked your talk, and I really liked the convergence of you talking about shine and opacity. And as soon as you started to kind of talk about that, the first thing I wanted to ask about is how does that then relate to frontals and like jewelry in hip hop culture? And again, I think that's also interesting because hip hop culture is another form of fabulation in terms of like citation as well. And then also specifically with frontals, where that's in your mouth. And so I'm just kind of interested in terms of like how does that kind of play into that kind of idea?
I mean,
I don't know if that's a question, sorry.
No, I mean, I think you have the beginning of a great paper with that, right? I mean, I think those are not things that I work with, but I think you have all of the parts there, right? Sort of thinking. I mean, I think what's interesting is to think sort of like specifically as you're doing, right? Like what is being covered, right? Like what is being made shiny, and what work that's doing to like obscure, and what is being obscured. Yeah. Krista Thompson has much more to say on hip hop than I do, and sort of like how shine works as an aesthetic in relation to that. But I think that's great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could say something about how you apply your own methodology to your own work. So if you step back and think about the empathetic reading, for example, and how that enables you to embody, inhabit, and deconstruct, or perhaps interpret several layers in a text or in a performance. And I'm wondering whether in a previous stage, if somehow the power of the erotic that Audre Lorde talks about, this empowerment and freedom and joy and deep sharing, I wonder if you could say something about that in your previous stage, so when the reader feels connected with the author through the piece, and whether the reader needs to have some sort of embraces of the erotic.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. I think in general, the way objects sort of come to me, and then I become attached to them, and then my process of writing is to figure out why I become so interested in it, because usually I've been thinking about a set of questions. So it really is that sort of, I am sitting alongside myself trying to figure out, like, okay, what exactly is this if I've been reading a lot of Spillers, what about this piece is like making me think about this? And then as you see, it just sort of keeps unfolding in layers. So it's sort of, I'll be like, oh, this is the thing I'm interested in. And then I'll come back, a few months later and be like, oh, no, now it's this. But so it does start with that kernel of, attachment and erotics and sort of like that. I don't write about things I don't like. Because I'm not a critic like that. It's not my job to say what is good or bad. That's not the function of art for me, right? The function is sort of, what can it make possible in the world? And so my way of accessing that is to think, what is it helping me to think through? What theory is it opening up? Or how have I now been able to think differently? So I definitely think that starts with, with attachment, with this sort of, these sensational flows. I would say, I don't know that, jouissance is different from the erotic in that it like retains that violence part of it, but there are elements of it that aren't necessarily that divergent, right? So which is to say, there's still a lot in the new book that is like, still trafficking in that kind of idea of,
So maybe one more question, because we're almost finished at the time.
Thank you very much, by the way. I haven't really had time to formulate into a proper question. There's much time, but I'm really curious what you meant by proposing like reclaimed identities as something that must become plural. If you could elaborate a bit on that, or does this have to do with fragmentation? Is this something voluntary? Yeah.
So like the reclaimed selfhoods being plural?
Yeah.
So a lot of that has to do with the desire to, it's hard to get things done without a selfhood, right? Without like a sense of selfhood. It's hard to imagine like a political framework without some sort of operationalized. I wanted to, but at the same time I wanted to acknowledge modes of fragmentation, but more I wanted to really center the ways that no one is alone, right? So I sort of wanted to think about kind of all of those things at once. So acknowledge the damage that happens through woundedness and various forms of violence, right? And how they can shatter selves. But I didn't want to just stick with the shattered self and sort of reify ideas of abjection, especially in relation to racialization. I sort of wanted to, but it's not about reproducing a wholeness, which is part of why it goes to plurality. Because it's sort of, that plurality can be, partial versions. It can be any sort of number of different types of things being enacted together. But I wanted to sort of think about, really what it is to sort of feel in relation, while acknowledging that there are many different ways of being in relation that are happening simultaneous. So anytime I'm talking about like, oh, this is citation that's going on, that's not the only thing that's happening. That's not the only mode of being in relation. It just so happens to be that's the one I'm talking about in this framework. But I wanted a way to kind of piece out those different modes of relating and really think about the differences between them, even while not making a claim that this one is the best, or any kind of thing like that. But that's sort of why. It's part of the overarching ethos of care, and also not wanting to allow racialized subjects to have this other mode of being that isn't just abjection, right? So
Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the Satterwhite video, it's really, this plurality of self is so beautifully rendered, because it's not just all these, not just this time, space bending with, and the citing of Patricia, but also there are these moments where Satterwhite is also themselves pluralized through in the video. There's many Satterwhites at the same time. Yeah. So, but thank you so much, Amber, for this very your brilliant talk. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.